The men who stood the last night watch are awake and moving without ceremony. They are not just waiting for orders, they are clearing the runway for the day to begin. What matters here is handover. On a longship, the day starts with continuity, not a trumpet. The night watch points out what has changed. A faint swell from the northwest, a low cloud bank, tar that cracked on a seam near the bow. This helps explain why Viking crews could move fast when it counted. Speed later depended on quiet attention now. The roles are simple to name, but they overlap in practice. At the top is the owner or chieftain, often the expedition's sponsor. He decides where the ship goes and why, but he does not steer minute by minute. The stýrimaðr, the steersman, does. He is the navigator and sailing master, and his authority runs with the wind and the water. Near him stands the helmsman on the great steering oar to starboard, the right-hand side that later gave English its word, starboard. The helmsman's job looks like force, but it is mostly feel. He balances the broad, shallow hull against wind pressure on the sail and the tempo of the oars. That detail reveals an important balance. Muscle answers to judgment. At the bow, one or two senior hands act as leaders of the forward end, and they watch for shoals, timing, and traffic. On a shallow-keeled ship, the bow meets trouble first, so its eyes matter. If the stýrimaðr is the brain, the bowmen are the ship's nerves. Their signals back, by hand, by voice, by habit, are part of the language that makes the hull a coordinated tool. Most of the crew are oarsmen. They sit on thwarts, the transverse benches, each man's space marked less by paint than by familiarity. Under and around them are seat chests, personal boxes that double as benches in storage. Archaeological finds like the Gokstad ship show chests and tent gear aboard. In practice, the sea chest is a man's locker, stool, and nightstand all at once. Why combine seat and storage? Space is the first constraint at sea. A longship trades cabin walls for speed and reach. By making the chest do two jobs, the crew keeps decks clear and weight low. That choice also disciplines personal kit. If it does not fit in the chest, it probably does not sail. The system encourages only what the voyage actually uses. Overhead, when weather allows, an awning or tent cloth stretches across light beams to shed spray and dew. Finds at Gokstad included tent equipment, and sagas mention war booths and shelters. Awnings matter because open boats are wet. A dry cloak at dawn can decide how steady a man's hands are an hour later, when a rope must be hauled quickly and cleanly. The last night watch has its own rhythm. One man scans the horizon and the sky. Another keeps a hand on the rigging, feeling for chafe. Someone bails. On clinker-built hulls, overlapping planks riveted and caulked, water creeps in and must be moved out. The Grettir saga mentions crews bailing day and night in bad weather. That is complaint in the story, but it is also procedure. Baling is not glamorous, but it is the point where maintenance touches survival. A few buckets now mean a lighter boat, a drier deck, and more margin when a squall hits. The important point is not just the water level. It is who notices it early. A watchkeeper who bails without being told is quietly buying speed and safety for everyone else. Commands are simple and loud when they need to be, but most work runs on short signals and shared timing. A ship's caller sets the rowing beat when oars are out. He might use a drum, a shout, or a chant. The tool exists to synchronize effort. Humans are strong alone, but hulls move when effort lands together. The caller's voice solves that coordination problem. At dawn, the ship's language comes alive in small ways. One hand taps the mast partner, a ring where the mast passes the deck, checking for looseness. Another checks the stays, the ropes that keep the mast upright, and runs a palm along the shrouds, feeling for worn spots. This helps explain why Viking ships could push their rigs hard. They planned for strain by finding trouble while it was still small. The sailcloth, usually heavy wool treated with fat or tar, gets a quick inspection at its lower edge where spray hits. Reef points, The rows of ties used to shorten the sail are checked so they will not jam later. That detail will matter when the morning breeze stiffens. A sloppy reef is not just slow. On a shallow-keeled ship it can be a sliding, sideways hazard. Food and water are not a separate department. They are woven into the handover routine. The night watch warms a morning drink if fuel and rules allow. Water skins are topped from shared casks. The logic is simple. Calories and fluids protect judgment. On a boat where one bad decision can open a plank seam, feeding the crew is also hull maintenance. The crew hierarchy shows up here in quiet privileges and louder duties. The stýrimaðr eats early, so he can think without interruption. The helmsman rotates hands off the steering oar, so the one at the handle stays sharp. Oarsmen wait for the caller's cue before they unwrap hands or oil leather oar loops. That staging builds discipline due to comfort. Ease comes only in a way that serves the next move. Navigation at dawn is a matter of subtracting uncertainty. If land was near at sunset, they note what shows now. If they have been out of sight of land, the stýrimaðr reads wind, swell, and the shape of the cloud. Stars fade, but their memory holds through the last watch. In some voyages, a simple shadow board, marking the sun's angle at noon, helped keep latitude. Whether or not every ship used one, the point is consistent. Tools existed to keep a chosen line. Sounding, the old practice of casting a weighted line to measure depth and feel the bottom, belongs to the same toolbox. A smear of tallow on the lead brings up sand or mud for the bowman to read. From the outside, that can seem like ritual. In practice, it is a coded map. Bottom type tells you which coast you might be approaching, and depth tells you how close risk has crept. Sagas hint at a rhythm of day and night, even in war. In one tale, a peace shield is raised at dusk to pause a fight, and men go to their booths to dress wounds and rest. We are not reenacting that scene here, but the logic transfers. The sea demanded pauses with rules. Dawn is when rules resume, and the first rule is to restore the ship before you ask it to sprint. Culturally, the ship is more than transport. Archaeology shows ship burials like Gokstad and Oarsberg, where high-status dead were laid in boats under mounds. Mythology speaks of warriors and a last battle at world's end. Even the story of a fight that resets each dawn tells us something. Daybreak is the reset of duty. On board, that belief becomes work. Pride shows up as a man who will not let his lashing creak. That cultural frame cuts both ways. Sagas also preserve quarrels at sea. Sharp words when one man shirks baling in a storm. The Grettir episode, with a crew exhausted and a passenger mocking them, shows the social edge around shipwork. The system needed conformity because the margin was thin. A man who ducked his task could be called out, even threatened, because everyone's skin was in the same hull. Sleeping arrangements explain why dawn is stiff. On an open longship, men sleep under awnings or in their cloaks, backs against chests, boots near hands. The habit is not romantic. It solves problems. You keep your gear dry and reachable. You conserve heat. And you wake in the same square yard where you will work next. That continuity keeps the morning calm instead of chaotic. Clothing choices also show the maintenance mindset. Wool is the default because it keeps warmth when wet and dries under a breeze. Cloaks serve as blankets and weather shields. Belts and knife sheaths hang where hands can find them in the half-light. The important point is that personal kit is tuned to ship demands. Fashion is function, because the deck will punish any excess. The ship itself is tuned the same way. A longship's shallow draft lets it glide over shoals and up rivers. But that advantage comes with sliding risk. Without a deep keel, lateral grip is weaker, so wind and wave can push the hull sideways. At dawn, the steersman plans the day with that physics in mind. If the wind is forecast to freshen, he will want reefing lines ready and oars at hand to control drift near hazards. Communication bridges physics and people. Hand signals carry along the length of the ship, palm down to slow, 2 fingers for 2 points off the wind, fist for hold. Shouts are simple and repeatable. The caller's chant might fold in commands so oar, stroke, and intention are one. This helps explain why crews could pivot from rest to rowing in an instant. The language they practiced at dawn paid off later when wind or coast forced a change. By mid-sunrise you see the day's pattern forming. Watchkeepers report. Poop. The stýrimaðr confers with the owner at the stern and the bowman forward. The helmsman feels the rudder bite and decides whether to unship it briefly to oil the loom. Oarsmen stretch without leaving their places, and a pair rotates through for a short baling stint. But that routine plants something. Each part of the ship owns a piece of the morning solution. If the sail will go up the yard, the long spar at the top of the sail gets hoisted in controlled steps. Men on halyards haul. A mastman clears the parrels that hold the yard to the mast, and bow leaders watch that the sail does not foul at the stem. The mechanics here matter more than the poetry. A clean hoist saves time later, and a fair set keeps the ship from fighting its own canvas. If rowing is the day's plan, the oars go outboard together. Leather loops slide over pegs, blades dip together, and the first strokes are slow. The caller sets a conservative beat. Why slow? Cold muscles tear and tired minds rush. Early restraint preserves both. Then, as warmth spreads and the ship finds her rhythm, the beat rises to the pace the day can afford. Food follows function. A bite of flatbread, dried fish, softened overnight. Maybe curds or a spoon of porridge if fuel was spared. Water is measured because casks are heavy to replenish. In practice, thirst is checked before hunger. A man can row on a half ration of food longer than on a half ration of water. That simple ranking prevents stubborn pride from turning into poor choices by afternoon. Maintenance circles back again before the first big push. A quick walk along the thwarts confirms that gear is stowed, lashings are tight, and no edge is poised to cut a rope. You might note this as fussiness, but on a wooden ship, edges and friction are the silent enemies. A frayed shroud at dawn becomes a parted shroud at noon, and then you are not sailing the ship, you are surviving it. Even decision-making gets its tune-up at dawn. The stýrimaðr announces the plan in short lines: distance hoped for, expected wind, rowing rotations, and any hazards anticipated. He names who will stand where if weather turns. This is not a speech. It is a promise of structure. That structure releases attention for the work at hand. Men know when they will row hard and when they will rest, and they steer their own energy like a shared resource. That leads to the open question that will carry us through the day. How do these people work in shifts all day without breaking the ship or themselves? The early answer is discipline by design. Seat chests fix where bodies go. The caller fixes when bodies move. The stýrimaðr fixes why the move is worth it, and dawn fixes the habit of checking first, then pushing. There is also an unspoken contract under all this. Ships were central to status in their world. In death, some elites took ships into the earth. In stories, warriors sailed to fight and return again, as if the sea itself had a rule of renewal. On deck, that belief becomes obligation. If you serve well, your ship carries you. If you neglect her, she answers in wood and water. By the time the sun clears a hand above the horizon, the longship is awake, not with spectacle but with readiness. Oars tested, sail checked, water shifted to casks and skins, rope coils tidy, and eyes assigned to arcs of sky and sea. The day's first hour has been spent making later hours cheaper. But that is the central logic here. Speed is purchased in small coins at dawn. The last act of the quiet start is to set the first watch of the day. Even with every hand at work, someone is always on watch. One mind is free to think only of threat and chance. That is not wasted labor. It is the way the ship pays for the unknowns it will meet by noon. In other words, vigilance is not a mood. It is a line item in the day's plan. We leave the first light with a picture of a crew that is not improvising survival. They are following a pattern that shapes both the boat and the men. The roles are clear, the checks are routine, and the culture behind them is both stern and proud. The next step is to see how this system handles movement. Oars, sail, and the first choices that will decide how far this hull can carry them today. The first real decision after dawn is movement. Oars or sail is not a romantic choice here. It is a calculation about wind angle, current, and hull strain. What mattered was not simply going, but going in a way the crew could sustain for hours without breaking the ship or the people. If the air is light or foul, the steersman points to oars. A longship's square sail cannot claw close to the wind the way a later foregaft rig can. The square needs a cooperative angle, and until that exists, muscle becomes the engine and timing becomes the transmission. Rowing starts with assignments. Each thwart, the crossbench, belongs to a pair, and each oar has a known personality, slightly heavier or lighter, a bit longer inboard or outboard. This helps explain why crews kept seats and swapped in a pattern. Knowing your oar's bite reduces wasted energy and protects the gunwale. They row in relays, because endurance does not come from heroics at sea. It comes from habit. Experimental voyages with reconstructed longships found that half-hour or so stints keep form from collapsing, and the principle is the same whether 30 minutes or a little more. In practice, that means one group rows while another rests, then they change without drama. The changeover is its own choreography. On command, blades come into parallel, tips up to avoid catching a wave, and the outside rowers ease the oars aboard. The resting pair swings out, settles feet under the thwart, and takes the loom, the thick inboard part, in a practiced grip. That detail tells us how much of longship speed rested on muscle memory rather than bursts of strength. Cadence is set by a human metronome. Sometimes the steersman counts, "Oh." Sometimes a lead rower gives the rate with short calls or strikes the gunwale with a stick. Synchronization mattered more than raw power, because mismatched strokes twist a long, flexible hull. In other words, the fastest boat is the one moving cleanly in one rhythm, not the one with a few men yanking harder. A clean stroke matters for safety too. If a blade catches a wave at the wrong moment, it can lever a man off balance or snap a thole. The oar post and loop that cradle the loom. That is why you hear cautions more than cheers during a hard pull. The important point is not just speed, but preserving the machine that makes speed possible. The hull itself rewards rhythm. A longship is narrow, shallow-keeled, and slightly flexible by design. This keeps draft low for beaching, but it also means the planking, clenched by iron rivets, works a little with the sea. Even strokes dampen that working. Uneven force makes the strakes chatter and open seams. That small mechanical truth explains why the caller's voice was a safety device as much as a pace setter. Under oars, the steersman's job is not to draw a straight line, but to keep the bow meeting seas at a survivable angle. Quartering a chop, where the bow meets waves at a slant, reduces pounding and keeps blades clear on the recovery. From the outside, this can look like an untidy snake path, but in practice it protects men and wood. Relays make sense only if the pauses are real. Off the oar, a man drinks, stretches his back, and maybe rubs tallow on a raw patch of loom. He will also bail if the sea is slopping aboard. Sagas remind us that bailing was not an embarrassment, it was survival. One law even set a standard for a ship considered unseaworthy, if she needed too much of it in calm weather. That legal line matters because it shows how crews judged risk. If a ship had to be bailed 3 times in 2 days by law, she failed their threshold for safety. On open water, men could refuse to sail a hull that took on too much. The implication is simple. Daily practice sat inside a culture where seamanship and legal habit reinforced each other. When wind favors them, the mood shifts. The sail is not magic canvas. It is heavy, often wool, and it asks for organized hands. Before any hoist, they secure loose gear and bring the ship's head up enough to tame the first load on the claw. That remove lowers the shock on the rig and buys time to correct mistakes. Hoisting starts with the yard, the long spar that carries the square sail along its top edge. A halyard, which is the hauling rope, rides over a block or a smooth sheave at the masthead. Men at the mast base take the line and walk it aft in short heaves. A voice at the mast calls the pace so the lift does not jerk. This helps explain why haste is rarely faster at sea. As the yard rises, hands at the braces. Those are the lines leading from the yard arms to either side of the ship. Keep the spar centered. Sheets, the ropes at the lower corners, are controlled but not yet loaded. The important point is to build tension in sequence, so the sail takes wind evenly, rather than slamming one clew and twisting the mast. Once the yard is at height and the sail set, they trim. With a square sail, you do not pull the bow into the wind so much as you rotate the yard on its braces to meet it, closing the angle to the wind enough for drive, but not so much that the sail luffs and flogs itself to pieces. Takes an eye. The steersman and the brace handlers have to agree, sometimes without seeing each other. On a reach, with wind across the beam, the boat feels alive with small accelerations. But the temptation to carry full cloth is exactly when discipline matters. Wool sails stretch when wet and flogging tears seams. That is why crews reefed early. Shortening sail before a squall keeps the yard and mast intact and avoids the terror of emergency work in a blast. Reefing a square sail is a job best done with the wind off the claw. They head into the wind to unload pressure, lower the yard a measured distance, and tie a row of reef points or lash the bunt of the sail to the yard. Whatever the exact method used on different ships, the logic is constant. Reduce area, increase control, and do it before the sea makes the choice for you. Tying quickly but cleanly matters because knots that jam or slip are not neutral. Poor lash binds a sail unevenly, and a lump on the yard makes the cloth fill badly once you set it again. That detail would shape the next tack. A rough reef now could cost an hour of speed later, so the calm tone on deck is not effect. It is the pressure valve that keeps seamanship from panic. Turning the ship with a square sail also follows the conservative rule. To tack, turning the bow through the wind, they might need a push with the oars, because the rig stalls head to wind. Wearing, turning the stern through the wind, is easier on gear but costs more distance. Crews chose based on sea room, not pride. This helps explain why some voyagers hugged shelter rather than show off in open water. The saga gives a glimpse of that instinct. In one account, when the gale built near the Solent Islands, the choice was simple. Let the Salundir shelter the men. That line is not poetry alone. It captures the seamanship reflex to put cliffs and channels between sail and storm, trade speed for control, and buy a pause to bail, fix lashings, and replan. Steering all of this is a side rudder, the steering oar, on the starboard side. Its very presence gives us the words starboard, steerboard, and it shapes how the ship behaves. The blade bites near the stern quarter, not on the center line. That means the helm has leverage, but also that a cross sea can grab it and kick. A good helmsman feels for that pull and leans the handle, often with both hands, before it becomes a lurch. Communication is not constant chatter, but it is steady. The lookout at the bow, especially in shoal water or fog, calls depths, drift, or debris with short words. We have a line in a saga where men in stem and stern could not see each other in a snowstorm, yet they carried on, bailing and holding their course. That tells us the ship's system assumed low visibility and built for it with rolls and repeated phrases. Leeway, the sideways slide under wind, is the enemy of precise sailing with a square rig. The longship accepts some of it because the shallow keel trades grip for beaching ability. The trick is to balance sail trim, helm, and even crew weight to keep the slide predictable. Men might sit higher to windward, lifting a rail a bit, to increase bite on the lee side. That sounds minor, but on a narrow hull, bodies are ballast. Every task under sail is also about not breaking the rig. A snapped yard is more than lost speed. It is a day, maybe days of work at sea. That is why shaving a few seconds on a reef is a bad bet. The mast step, the spar fittings, and the leathered mast partners all prefer smooth loads. The important point here is not just material science but culture. The crew's pride is keeping the gear healthy while still arriving fast. Under oars with the sail up, the systems blend. In a headwind, light rowing can help the bow punch through waves, while the sail is left to reduce strain. On a reach after leaving shelter, a handful of oars might dip for a dozen strokes to bring the ship higher before the next notch of brace trim. Small moves compound. A dozen smart strokes now save a mile of drift later. Rowers learn to time the sea, not the clock. Catch the blade as the stern lifts and use gravity on the drive. Keep the recovery clean as the bow falls to avoid burying. This is not poetry about waves. It is a mechanical reality of keeping water out of the boat. A poorly timed stroke throws spray across the thwarts and into the bilge, and the next order, after a sloppy set, is never heroic. It is bale. Baling is constant background labor in an open, low freeboard ship. Crews used wooden scoops and leather buckets to throw water over the side between strokes or during rest. The saga image of exhausted men bailing while the ship worked in a gale underlines a fact. Fatigue at sea builds invisibly until a small gap becomes a problem. This helps explain the importance of rotations and short, practiced handoffs. Authority on a longship is practical. The steersman has the con, but the watchcaller, the sail handlers, and even a veteran rower can trigger a caution. A shout of "hold" freezes a line. Nobody wants a loop to bite a wrist because a command was unclear. In practice, that humility protects speed. Clear stopping lets a crew reverse a small mistake before it becomes structural. Now and then, someone resists the rhythm. One saga tells of a man who refused to bail or tend sail, even while others exhausted themselves in a leaky, storm-racked ship. His verses mocked the labor. It is instructive that the reaction on board was not literary debate. It was anger at someone breaking the system that kept everyone alive. That moment reveals that work at sea was social glue, not just effort. Speed is felt as much in the helmsman's hands as in the wake. A well-trimmed square and a steady cadence produce a quiet energy. The boat tracks, spray patterns repeat, and the steering oar eases rather than fights. This feedback loop guides small choices. A gentle helm means the braces are right. A hard helm means the sail is arguing with the course. The next move follows from that sensation. Turning across a swell, you feel the ship change gait. With oars still, the boat may wallow in the trough. With 2 or 3 oars pulling on the new windward side as the yard comes across, she carries momentum through the dead zone. That hybrid moment is delicate. What mattered here was sequencing. Brace first, then a touch of oar, then sheet. Each small effort placed to keep the hull thinking forward. When a squall line approaches, the deck does not erupt. One voice calls for shorter cloth, and men slide into pre-agreed spots. Sheets ease a little to unload. The halyard team lowers on a measured count. Hands take the bunt, the belly of the sail, and tie it higher. That detail reveals the ethic on board. Calm ritual replaces panic because a square sail punishes chaos. It is tempting to imagine the Vikings as choosing the hard way for glory. The record suggests something else. They often chose the smart way for survival. Sheltering under islands, waiting out a gale, or rowing short stints to keep form all point to a culture where reputation came from arriving with crew and ship intact. The violent stories exist, but the routine is what made those stories possible. On a fair run, with the wind abaft the beam, the next challenge is control. A square sail can push the bow to yaw, slewing from side to side. The helmsman counters with small, early inputs, and by asking for a touch more brace to windward. If it still grows, he may call a preventer line to tie the yard's leeward arm. It is dull work that keeps drama at bay. Even in good wind, rowing can creep back into the plan. A tide turning against an estuary mouth makes a standing wave. Oars add steerage and get you onto a flood before the eddy spins you. That mix of muscle and cloth is the longship's signature. The important point is integration. The boat is not either machine. It is both at once, tuned to whatever the water allows. By midday, the habit of relays shows its value. Men are tired but not wrecked. Hands are blistered, but the form holds. The caller's rate falls a notch to conserve. That is not weakness, it is map. Rowers tire faster than the sea calms, so the system banks capacity for afternoon weather rather than spending it all before noon. Steering through afternoon chop, the lookout's voice remains crisp. Shallows show as a new color on water, a different wave break. The helmsman asks for up a point, and the braces come a hand's breadth in. That tiny trim change can be the difference between riding a bar and slamming it. The process explains why seamanship lives in half measures done at the right time. The crew knows when not to fight physics. Beating too close to wind with a square sail stalls the cloth and pounds the bow. 60 degrees off the wind with life in the sail is often faster than 40 with struggle. That trade teaches patience. In practice, the better angle wins the hour, and the day follows the hour. As the sun arcs, fatigue makes small errors attractive. An oar shipped a second too late strikes a wave, kicks and bruises a wrist. A brace tied with a hasty hitch creeps under load. These are why the caller's voice stays level. He shapes attention as much as cadence. This helps explain why the most valuable crew members are often the ones who can slow a deck down without argument. All the while, decisions rest on a keel that can only forgive so much. A shallow draft is wonderful near beaches and in rivers, but it magnifies risk in confused seas. That contradiction runs through the day. The same design that makes the longship versatile demands fast, conservative seamanship when the sea turns. The crew lives inside that trade and measures every move against it. As afternoon fades, the ship still needs to make way. But nobody pretends human fuel is infinite. The next watch preps early. Men stretch, drink, and retie foot ropes on the yard to be ready if the call comes to shorten. That quiet staging reduces surprises. The important point is that routine keeps decision space open when weather tries to close it. The hour will come when wind drops or drifts foul and the oars return. The rule is the same. Swap cleanly, set cadence, and row as if the hull could hear the difference. Because in a way it can. A boat pulled in rhythm stays tight, leaks less, and slaps fewer waves into the bilge. If the strokes fall ragged, the sea notices and collects its tax. The deck's mood, then, is not grim severity. It is concentrated like a workshop with a dangerous tool. Every man knows when to speak and when to pull. That social map is propulsion as much as the sail. It gets the ship across water without burning the crew before the hard hours, which may come at dusk, or in fog, or in a short squall tests every knot. They tied at noon. This is the pressure building beneath routine. Rowers tire faster than weather shifts. Sails drink strength if set at the wrong angle. Steering is easiest when visibility is worst. The contradiction is what the system answers. It layers oar relays, calm reefing, and measured helm into a pattern that turns long hours into safe miles. By evening, the ship's record for the day is written in quiet things. A mast still straight, a yard unscarred, men who can still laugh while coiling a line. What mattered in all the motion was not bravado, but discipline that made speed safe. And tomorrow we'll ask the same question again, with different wind and different water. The next challenge sits just beyond this momentum. Distance is nothing if it is aimed wrong. When fog falls or landmarks vanish, the best cadence and the nicest reef are not enough. The crew's rotation and sail handling only work if they know where to point the bow and when to stop forcing an angle. That is where navigation and watch discipline move from background to center. When the sails settled and the oars found their pace, the next job was invisible, keeping the ship aimed at a place no one could yet see. That meant navigation as a working habit, not a single heroic decision. The important point is they ran on dead reckoning first, course, speed, and time, maintained as a mental log by the steersman and anyone trusted to track it. Dead reckoning existed because there were no charts to speak of on an open deck, and because the ocean keeps few signposts. In practice, they paired a chosen heading with a running guess at speed, then multiplied by time to picture distance made good. This helps explain why the crew cared about stable pace and honest watchkeeping. The navigator's math only holds if someone can say how long and how fast they have truly gone. Speed was never just a guess pulled from thin air. Under oars, the caller's cadence and the known endurance of each relay gave a baseline, and they cross-checked by wake behavior and how quickly familiar chops slid past the strakes. Under sail, they compared wind angle and trim to remembered performance. This reach, in this breeze, usually gave a certain run in a watch. That detail reveals how a ship becomes a measuring device once you learn its tendencies. Time, too, was practical rather than scientific. They watched the suns climb, and within each watch they used settled tasks as anchors. A bale cycle, a swap of war relays, a prayer before eating. The point was not precision to the minute, but consistency inside the crew's routine. In other words, the mental log worked because daily habits created dependable time markers, even when clouds ruled the sky. Close to land, dead reckoning was only a backbone. Coastal pilotage filled in the gaps with texture. Sailors read headlands by outline and color, and they watched how tide rips formed seams in the surface. The smell of kelp and the flight lines of seabirds told them where fish, reefs, or river mouths might be. What mattered here was building a composite picture faster than any one clue could deliver alone. Seabirds were especially revealing because they kept schedules. Gulls and auks ran straight lines between colonies and feeding grounds, and their height and direction hinted at how far land or shallow banks lay. When birds lifted late and low, it suggested nearby breakers or a tucked-in bay. This helps explain why a quiet minute at dawn could move the whole plan. Those lines in the sky were almost like drawn arrows on a chart. The water itself talked through color and motion. Green-brown hinted at shoals or river silt, while deep, cold blues usually meant safe depth offshore. In tide country, a stationary boil meant a rock just shy of breaking. Crews learned to split attention, one man watching the light on the waves, another fixed on shore silhouettes, another smelling the breeze, each calling short notes the steersman could stitch together. Sounding kept all of this honest. A lead line, basically a weighted cord knotted at intervals, gave depth by feel and count, and with a tallow plug on the lead, it brought up bottom. Sticky mud, coarse sand, or shell bits each said something about what lay ahead. Norse evidence is thin in places, but this method was standard northern seamanship, and frequent casts saved hulls. The important point is not the device, but the habit. Check early, check often, and believe the line. On a long ship with a shallow keel, depth mattered in a different way than on deep-drafted ships. Their virtue was sailing where others could not, but that same gift made them vulnerable to skimming a rock at speed. This is why sounding underway often led to an immediate choice. Shorten sail, shift weight aft, or change the angle across the tide. That earlier reading would shape the next command at the mast. The sagas capture the stakes more bluntly. In one tale, a crew rode a raging current and then struck a hidden rock. The order was clear. Drop the sail quickly and try poles to push free. The poles found no bottom. They had to wait for the tide. What mattered there was the sequence. Reduce drive, test depth, accept patience, because force against the wrong depth was how planks opened and men drowned when squalls arrived. Beyond coastlines, The sky carried most of the reference points. The sun's path marked east to west daily, and even with clouds, the memory of where it should sit at a given hour was useful. Crews used a noon moment, the sun at its highest, to confirm a rough north-south line. The explanation is simple. If you rotate your imagined compass around a steady noon line, you can orient a course even when the horizon dissolves. At night, stars did that job better when clouds allowed it. The North Star, Polaris, rides low over northern latitudes, and its height changes slowly with your own. Viking Age navigators did not measure angles with sextants, but they knew star patterns by practice. A helmsman could hold a course by aligning a star with the steering oar loom or a mast feature, and swap to a nearby star later in the night as the sky turned. A debated tool enters here. A fragment found at Unartok in Greenland looks like part of a sun compass, a flat disk with markings that might help track a shadow toward true north at midday. Some researchers believe crews could also use shadow lines from a gnomon, a small stick or pin, to set a travel line when the sun returned after clouds. Even if rare, the concept reveals a mindset. Fix a reference when you can, and carry it forward in your head. Then there is the sunstone. Texts mention a solarstein, sometimes linked to crystals that polarize light and reveal the hidden sun's direction through haze. The evidence is uncertain, and the term may cover a range of meanings. The disciplined takeaway is this: whether or not a sunstone sat on the thwart, cross-checking many small cues mattered more than any single trick. Belief aside, the navigator's safety came from redundancy. Animals played into that redundancy. Saga tradition says Floki released ravens at sea to find land. If the bird circled back, no shore lay within easy reach, but if it set off with purpose, it had a destination it trusted. That sounds romantic, yet the practice is practical. Ravens prefer land and seldom loiter over the open sea. Using behavior as a probe was old seamanship, not magic, and it shifted guesswork into higher confidence. All of this works until fog arrives. Then watch discipline becomes the core technology. The ship divided sightlines into sectors, with lookouts named to each arc left and right of the bow, plus one aft to read wake and wind. The steersman focused on feel, swell direction against hull, wind on cheek, and the drum beat under the plank floor that told him speed. They trimmed the sail down or struck it entirely to keep steerage without outrunning their senses. Under fog, sounding frequency jumped from occasional to constant. Then, a man at the bow cast and called out depth cleanly. 5, shoaling. 4, mud. Another listened for the plunk and the line's angle, which revealed current. In practice, this cadence set the ship's heartbeat. If depths fell faster than expected, the next order was prepared even before the number landed. That habit traded speed for certainty, which is how more crews made it home. Ears often mattered more than eyes when visibility failed. Surf has a range. The low roar of distant breakers builds in a way most crews learn it as boys. Inlets have a smell. Brackish water carries silt and life that hits the nose differently than open brine. Even the slap of small chop against rock ledges has a signature. In other words, the environment broadcasts its map and sound and scent if you trained yourself to hear it. Fog also tested the Dead Reckoning log's integrity. Errors grow when you cannot confirm them against features, so good navigators bounded their uncertainty on purpose. They might stand off through the night rather than risk a blind entry, or they might deliberately aim to hit a coastline safely downwind, then work back along it in daylight. This helps explain why caution under fog was not hesitation. It was calculated survival. Watch rotations tightened, not loosened, when visibility dropped. Fresh eyes beat long stares, so sectors swapped more often and with fewer words. Simple hand signals replaced shouts to avoid audio clutter, and the helmsman repeated the last change quietly, so the mental log updated in every head that needed it. The cultural point hides here. Authority set the tone. But vigilance was communal when the world shrank to a few ship lengths. Decisions still came from a small group at the center. The helmsman, the skipper, and one or two of the best sailors weighed the cues and issued short orders. From the outside, this can seem like informal talk, but in practice it followed a pattern. New information, risk to hull, options ranked by reversibility. The important point is not just that hierarchy existed, but that the system prized reversible moves first when visibility was gone. On longer passages, especially to Iceland or West Greenland, the mental map stretched into a different shape. Crews used latitude sailing in a loose way. Hold a consistent north-south position by the sun and stars. Then follow that band east or west until birds, driftwood, or temperature told you land was near. Species mattered. Eiders and puffins said colonies and coasts. Kittiwakes and fulmars told of banks rich with fish, but not always land within a short sail. Whale spouts and pack ice added their own information for the far north. Cold air over the sea can make a false horizon line that experienced eyes read as a clue, and ice fields push birds and seals toward certain lanes. None of this was an exact science, but the mental chart improved with each crossing, and captains passed spoken, sailing directions as chains of landmarks, distances in days, and currents to expect. Oral memory filled the role of a pilot book. Memory had limits, and sagas named those limits. Hafvilla, sea bewilderment, appears in stories where crews lose the sense of where they are. The culture's answer was not complicated gear. It was structure, stick to watches, rest in turns, keep quiet logs, and be willing to drift safely rather than choose a blind hazard. That detail would shape the next decision when clouds finally lifted, and all eyes searched for confirmation. Anchoring under uncertainty had constraints of its own. Longships carried anchors sized for coastal work, and in deep water they were no help. Near land, if depth and holding allowed, dropping the hook bought time to map sound and smell without sweep from the tide. Otherwise, the safest version of lying to was to keep enough way on the ship under short canvas or light oars to hold her bow to the swell and avoid a broach. Leadline reports did more than protect the hull. Bottom field told stories about where you were within a larger system. Fine sand often meant open beaches, sticky mud hinted at estuaries, gravel pointed to exposed shores near higher ground. When casts began to bring up bits of shell and stringy weed, crews smelled nearby shoal beds and shallower water. In practice, those cues were like stepping stones back to a coastline you could not see. All of this made the navigator less a single specialist and more a role shared by habit. The helmsman held the thread, but anyone trained to notice might see the one thing that corrected the picture. That explains why crews taught boys by assigning them to watch birds, or to hold the line, or to name clouds. You build a ship's brain by building many small brains that agree on the world outside the rail. Belief rode along, but it did not steer alone. An omen was a topic, a raven was a test. Men might mutter a charm before a tricky landfall, yet they still checked depth, listened for surf, and eased the sheet. The important point is not that they lacked mysticism, but that outcomes rewarded the seamanship more than the story. Over time, the boats that paired both confidence and caution left more descendants to talk about it. The irony is that in fog, routine feels slow even when it is your only speed. Slower sail, shorter watches, more sounding. All of it makes a day feel cramped and stretched at once. But this helps explain the Viking advantage. Their boats were built to adjust quickly, and their crews were trained to move from bold run to careful creep without pride getting in the way. Speed meant nothing if you crushed your keel on a stone just out of sight. When morning finally thinned the haze, the work only shifted shape. A pale smear of land became decisions about approach, tide, and where to put a hull that had no deep foredeck or big anchor windlass to save it from a bad guess. The mental map, updated all night by whispers and numbers, met the first real outline of a headland. And now, everything they reserved in caution would pay for a clean entry and a place to rest. All the navigation habits only worked if the people running them could keep moving. On a longship, that meant food and water were not luxuries. They were a timed system. What mattered was less what they ate than when and how they managed it. The day's meals were built around watches and weather. Crews ate quickly, often on changeover, so the fresh watch could row or handle sail with steady hands. This helps explain why cold meals dominated at sea. An open deck, tarred seams, and running rigging made flames dangerous. A single spark could scar a wool sail or weaken a rope, and a tipping hearth could turn control into chaos. In practice, fires were for shore, or for rare calm water with a sand-filled box and strict supervision. So food was chosen to be safe without cooking. Dried fish, salted or smoked meat, hard bread, and tubs of butter or cheese carried calories without heat or spoilage for days. That detail reveals the logic. Hearty fats and salt stabilized energy across long, damp hours. Preserved dairy mattered more than it sounds today. Whey or soured milk, kept in skin bags or small barrels, traveled well and offered both liquid and salts. Crews thinned it or drank weak ale because mild fermentation lowered pathogen risk compared to stagnant water. Water itself, rowed in barrels housed low for stability. Lashings kept them from slamming under oar benches, and a quartermaster or steersman guarded the taps. Rationing by watch prevented mid-shift surges that could dull judgment. One saga detail places a lidded tub near the mast for communal drinking. It sounds unsanitary to modern ears, but the lid kept spray out, and the tub enforced equal access. In other words, it was a control point in the center of work. The measure was simple and visible. A shared dipper, a marked horn, or a known ladle size issued per man per draw. This worked because no one paused to haggle during a reef or attack. The system had to run on habit. The important point is that drink and time were linked. Eating followed the same logic. On some merchant voyages, cooks were not even appointed. Messmates drew lots ashore to prepare porridge or stew when the boat beached. At sea, that practice hardened into packets of ready food, parceled by crew group. Hard bread and dried fish traveled in sacks under thwarts and in sea chests that doubled as seats. Butter and meat sat in small tubs, sometimes sealed with brine or cloth, to keep them from picking up bilge smells. Weight placement doubled as ship trim, another quiet tie between diet and handling. Cold meals had a rhythm. A slice of dried meat, a slab of bread, a smear of butter, maybe a clutch of cheese, eaten fast between jobs. The simplicity reduced decision time and kept hands free for ropes and oars. Fish on the line could supplement, but only when speed allowed. Dragging hooks slowed a hull, and hauling a catch during gusty wind risked a foul line. Crews chose their moments, which tells us how calories were always balanced against control. Salt and fat were not indulgent here. They were medicine by other means. Long work with wet skin drains both, so a salty, fatty bite cut cramping and staved off fatigue better than lean meat alone. This helps explain why butter appears so often in lists of stores. Illness and injury came from friction and water, not just battle. Oar blisters tore, rope fibers cut palms, and damp cuffs raised raw, salt-stung rashes. First-line care was simple. Salves, cloth wraps, and rotation off the hardest station. Salves could be animal fat, mixed with herbs known for soothing, applied at night or under wraps. The exact recipe mattered less than the method. Keep it clean, keep it covered, and keep the hand moving enough to avoid stiffening. In practice, small injuries were treated like gear, maintained to keep the whole system working. Rotation was health policy as much as seamanship. A swollen hand could be moved to a lighter oar, or off the rowing bench to a baler's post, and a raw foot could be lifted a watch by trading jobs. That detail would shape the next decision when weather turned. Cleanliness was not ceremonial. It was survival. Clothes and bedding were aired at midday, when sun and wind allowed, hung from oars or spread over the sail laid to rest, drying cut mildew, reduced skin rot, and made sleep restorative instead of clammy. Decks were scraped and sanded to lift slime and spilled fat. Bilges were kept sweet by frequent baling and by airing the hull when possible, which reduced rot and foul smells that can mask the scent of real trouble. This helps explain why baling was constant, even in fair weather. Waist had rules tied to wind and order. Men went over the lee side, away from the sail's pull and the steering oar, both for safety and to keep the central work area clean. The habit turned a private need into a controlled, almost invisible part of ship life. Seasickness was handled with the same pragmatism. The first day could put a new man flat, so watches absorbed him into lighter tasks and kept him drinking small sips. By day 2 or 3, most adapted, and the routine tightened back to full strength. If this sounds restrained, that is the point. Chroniclers love to record brutality ashore, from blood feuds to grisly war customs, and those stories traveled. Yet at sea the same culture demanded restraint, because chaos wastes strength and invites loss. There is a revealing contradiction here. The people dubbed barbarous by their enemies managed a vessel with rules, rations, and health habits sharper than many neighbors. That blend of force in war and discipline at work is the seam that held their voyages together. Leadership showed up most clearly in the ration board, not just in the sword rack. A steersman and shipmaster tuned food and drink to weather plans. Heavier food before a rowing stretch, lighter sips before a delicate sail change. The next step depended on that earlier choice. Onshore time was used like a clinic. When a safe beach appeared, fires came first, then cooking, then clothes spread to dry, then wounds inspected. What mattered here was that cooking ashore reset the cold meal clock for the next run. A pot of grain porridge, boiled with scraps of meat or fish, brought back warmth and hydration at once. It also cleared the decks of fuel and embers before sailing again. In other words, controlled heat was a shore tool that underwrote safer speed at sea. Short seasons narrowed scurvy risk on coastal voyages, but long passages still courted deficiency if storms extended days. That is why crews for distant runs carried more dairy, and aimed for landfalls to resupply fresh food when possible. Strategy included vitamins, even if not by name. The communal tub by the mast did more than quench thirst. It enforced a shared pace and reminded everyone that strength was pooled, not hoarded. That culture smoothed moments when a man had to give up a seat to heal or needed an extra ladle after a cold watch. All of this fed into evening. As light thinned, the next watches reviewed rations, checked salves, and laid out dry cloaks. The important point is not just comfort, but readiness. A warm, dry hand reefs faster, rows cleaner, and judges distance better in dusk. When fog returns or wind veers after sunset, the quiet choices of the day become visible. The ship that ate on time and aired its clothes answers a reef call without fumbling. The one that chased a hot meal aboard is slower on the line when it matters. By the time the horn signals the night rotation, the prize is clarity, not indulgence. Food, drink, and clean habits have kept minds sharp enough to weigh risk without bravado. That is how a longship holds speed and safety in the same hand. What follows will test that balance. The weather shift we have been bracing for asks the crew to trade sail for oars and back again under thin light. Their capacity to do that comes straight from what they stored, shared, and saved all day long. Rest on a longship did not look like rest on land. It happened in short slices, under low awnings or tarps stretched midships, with bodies tucked around sea chests and thwarts. The goal was not comfort but readiness, because sleep was measured against the next sail change, the next tide gate, or the next hour when oars would be needed again. Awnings existed because open decks offered no shelter from wind or spray. Crews raised tent frames with spars and lines, then threw wool or sailcloth over them to make a roof. In rain, the angle mattered. A sloppy pitch collected water and sagged, while a tight, low tilt shed it quickly and reduced windage if the ship needed to move fast. In calmer weather, off-watchmen slept in two groups, rotated against rowing or lookout duty. Sleep cycles matched the work cycle rather than a clock, because watches ran from seamanship needs, not hours. That detail reveals a practical truth. The best rest was the kind that ended right before hands were required, minimizing groggy delays when the call came. Each man kept his sea chest under or right beside his rowing place. It served as a seat, a locker, and a small claim of territory. The system worked because the chest kept gear dry, ready, and within reach. When a horn sounded, or a shouted order broke the quiet, the difference between order and scramble came down to whether knives, mittens, oar leathers, and cloaks were exactly where they belonged. Personal kits were lightweight and layered for wet living. A wool cloak doubled as a blanket, a pad, and a sail palm for rough stitching. Small bags held a horn spoon, beaker, a whetstone, waxed thread, spare ties, and a gaming piece or two, because off-time existed, and crew used it to stay sane and keep their fingers skilled. Games mattered less for fun than for rhythm. Aboard encounters like Nefatovo kept minds alert without wearing out arms, and filled a social function like a work song. This helps explain why we find game pieces in graves and wrecks. On a cramped deck, fixed rules and small wins were a safe way to bleed off tension. Storytelling carried more weight. A recited saga was entertainment, but it also taught expectations. How a captain should act, how a man should hold himself, what counted as honorable or foolish. When a teller quoted a shipboard law from a king's story, it was not court evidence. It was a remembered template that turned abstract law into lived habits on wood and salt. Sources describe codes that read like crew rules. One tale praises a leader who refused raw pressed meat and forbade robbing traders or harming women, even during raids. The important point is not whether every voyage matched that rule, but that seafarers carried an idea of restraint aboard. In tight quarters, controlled behavior protected the ship as much as the shield. On deck, authority sat with the ship's owner or the steersman. The helmsman trusted to read wind and water. But even a hard captain listened to a counsel, because local knowledge, rigging skill, and provisioning sense lived in different men. In practice, calls about course, reefs, or ration cuts were argued in short direct exchanges, then fixed by a final word. There is a reason that pattern survived. A ship under oars cannot afford the lag of long debate, yet decisions suffer if one perspective dominates. A thing like counsel compressed both needs into minutes. The crew could suggest, warn, and offer alternatives, and the captain could still hammer the decision into one voice. That mixture protected speed without blinding the ship to risk. We see the echo of this in saga battle scenes that pause for rules. After a day of fighting, a peace shield goes up. Camps are set, wounds are dressed, and order returns before the next day's clash. That detail tells us something important about expectation. Even in violence, there were agreed pauses and processes, which map naturally onto shipboard debates and ration decisions. Discipline aboard was not abstract. Punishments cost time or hands, so preferred tools were fines due, loss of share, extra duty, or correction in public. The logic was simple. Fix the behavior, keep the body. Only threats to the ship's safety, like violence during a maneuver or theft of water, could push a crew toward harsher measures or expulsion ashore. The risk culture behind this was real. Ship burials put dead elites inside vessels or under vessels, anchoring identity to boats and crews, and sagas hold up the afterlife for the daring. That does not mean recklessness steered decisions. It means risk was normalized and narrated. In other words, courage was expected, and prudence became the proof that courage served something larger than pride. Sleep, then, was earned by fulfilling that compact. Off-watch men slid under awnings with boots handy, cloaks draped, and their knives on lanyards, so nothing was lost in the dark. In foul weather, they went even simpler, bedding right on their sea chests with a second cloak over the head. That choice trapped warm breath, cut wind, and left a pair of hands ready. Wet decks force small habits. Men turned their cloaks inside toward the wind to shed spray better, stowed spare socks or foot wraps near heat only on shore, and rotated sleeping spots so one place did not stay soaked. This helps explain the strong preference for beaching or anchoring under land when possible. A single night of real drying could buy days of steadier hands. A cramped crew cannot carry grudges far. Grievances were aired fast, often during a meal window, because irritation turned into errors at ropes and oars. Conflict resolution borrowed from home law, but it fit the rail. Speak your case, accept a measured fine or task, stop the bleed. That social habit saved time, and it stopped anger from hardening during long, wet hours. Sagas also preserved the cost of letting order slip. In one account, men lounged ashore at dawn, talking and gaming, while ships lay near a harbor in low wind. A sudden flood roared down, timbers slammed into hulls, and crews cut anchor ropes in panic as vessels slewed out, some already damaged. The lesson carried: on coasts, someone keeps watch, even at ease. Who held the watch while others slept was part custom, part merit. Young hands climbed the ladder by taking the cold hours, while older rowers with proven judgment took the easier middle stretches, but were expected to wake at a call. That arrangement was not generosity. It preserved muscle groups for the next push, and it pushed experience toward decisions when decisions mattered most. Women rarely sailed on war cruisers, but mixed crews and family passages on traders happened. The ship's code, echoed in those restraint lines about not taking women by force, did more than police behavior. It defined the ship as an ordered space apart from the raid. That boundary kept focus on seamanship and trade, and it made reputation portable from fjord to fjord. Meals and rest also bent around authority. The food steward, often the owner's man, measured out ration bags and sour drink on a cadence agreed with the steersman's plan. If rough water was coming, a portion might be advanced before the work, with a dry bite held back for after. This worked because blood sugar and judgment fall together faster than pride admits. Sleep breaks were not equal, but they were defended. A man caught stealing minutes from another's off-watch drew swift correction, because fatigue propagated like a crack in a plank. From the outside, this can seem harsh over small thefts of time, but in practice the system relied on predictability. Rest owed became work owed, and the ledger of trust kept the oars even. Under awnings, order remained visible. Chests formed lanes, ropes were coiled the same way each day, and wet clothing hung on the same stakes, so anyone in the dark could find what they needed. That repeatable map is what allowed a woken crew to go from asleep to working in heartbeats, and it is exactly what the late-day wind shift will now test. Late in the day, the smooth repetition breaks. A squall line darkens the horizon, low and fast, and the air tightens in that way sailors read without instruments. The watch leader taps the steersman's shoulder and lifts 2 fingers, stand by to shorten sail. That gesture is not drama. It is a system switch, because the first minute decides whether the ship meets the edge tidy or tangled. They start with the wind, not the cloth. The helmsman eases the steering oar a few degrees to luff the bow toward the gusts and spill pressure. This matters because a square sail will fight you if you attack the lines while it is still driving hard. In practice, they want the canvas to go slack enough that hands can move near it without being slammed or trapped. The order of work moves across the deck like a practiced ripple. 2 hands take the sheets to ease the clews, the lower corners of the sail so the belly deflates. Another pair steps to the braces, the lines that swing the yard to either side, and centers it. Centering reduces twist, keeps the yard predictable, and stops the head of the sail from flogging into splinters. Only then does the halyard team move. The halyard is the hoist line, running through a block near the masthead, and down to a fall that several men can heave together. Lowering the yard is not just about height. It brings the reef points, short lengths of rope sewn along the sail, down to reach. On a longship, that means most reefing happens from the deck, not aloft. As the yard comes down to chest height, a small group flows in with leather thongs and reef ties. They pull a band of sail into a neat fold and lash it tight at regular intervals. What matters here is symmetry. If one side is tighter than the other, the sail sets crooked, and in a squall that imbalance can drag the bow off course. The system avoids that by pairing hands and pacing the knots as a counted rhythm. The halyard team stands by again. On the steersman's nod, they sweat the yard back up. Not to the full height of fair weather, just enough that the shortened sail can draw without overpowering. This sequence, luff, ease, brace, lower, reef, hoist, prevents jams and keeps the cloth alive for the next hour. Tearing a sail is not only material loss. It breaks the ship's main engine and forces everyone to the oars. While that is happening, another switch is already underway. Rowers from the last off-shift step to stand by along their benches, oars shipped but ready to run out. This helps explain why watches were never simply sleep and wake. There was always a third category, standby. In a squall, that category is the bridge between propulsion modes. The sky closes. Rain hammers the deck and the wind lifts its voice enough to swallow orders. Here the crew steps into a second system. Communication under noise. They cut language down to agreed words and fix signals. Arms crossed at the chest, strike the sail. A hand chopping down, downhaul. 2 fingers circling, brace to port. It is not ceremonial. It is the only way to move a 30-meter machine when you cannot hear your own name. Saga writers noticed this kind of moment, even when they loved the poetry more than the process. One storm narrative speaks of men in the stern, not seeing those in the stem as snow drove across the deck, and of bailing water while the ship labored north to shelter among the Solander. The detail is specific because the problem is bodily. If you cannot see the other end of the ship, you trust the signals and the drill. Then comes the decision that separates a fast ship from a lucky one. Do they keep sailing reefed and hard, or do they take the power off and heave to wait the line out? Heaving to is the art of almost stopping. On a square sail, you can back the shortened canvas slightly against the wind and hold the bow partly up. Lash the steering oar and let the ship drift at a controlled angle. It trades miles for survivability. The important point is that patience is also seamanship. Sagas preserve a memory of crews who tucked behind islets to let the Solander shelter the men. They did not mistake inaction for weakness. They read risk as a series of ratios: sail to wind, distance to lee shore, strength left in hands versus time left in weather. Waiting can be the strongest move available. If they choose to ride it out, one more habit clicks into place. Buckets and bailers come forward and settle into a constant chain. Water over the gunwale is no insult to pride. It is math. The lighter the hull, the more responsive the steering, and the safer the margin when a beam sea tries to shove the ship sideways. The Grettir story of men bailing day and night rings here as a caution. Storms punish anyone who tries to be clever at the expense of working together. Not every threat arrives from above. Shoaling water adds a second pressure. One lookout shifts from scanning clouds to reading sea color, because even in gray weather, water too thin for comfort can show a brown-green tinge and a different chop. That observation triggers the next system, soundings. A lead line comes off its peg, its plummet greased with tallow. The lead line is simple and brilliant. A rope marked at intervals, a heavy lead at its end, and a smear of tallow that will pick up sand, shell, or mud when it kisses bottom. A hand at the bow swings it forward and lets it run. When it falls, he feels the bump, glances at the mark, and shouts depth in familiar measures. Bottom feel travels up in the smear. Sand means one thing for holding, weed or stone means another. Rapid-fire casts turn into a rhythm: forward, drop, call, haul. That cadence matters because depth does not change politely. It can step up in ridges or fall off a ledge in the space of a few ship lengths. The helmsman responds to each call with small corrections, using the steering oar as leverage to edge seaward or inward. The next step depends on those numbers holding steady. If the bottom rises faster than the ship can turn, a harder choice appears. Edge out under reefed sail and oars, or anchor now and stop the slide toward a lee shore. Anchoring in weather is not a pause button. It is another choreography. The anchor party drags the iron forward. The rope line, lies flaked and ready with no knots to catch. One hand checks the bitter end is made fast. That detail will shape the next minute. At the word they drop, not thrown, lowered fast so the flukes do not foul or bounce. Then they pay out scope, that is, extra line length, 3 to 5 times the depth or more, if the gusts demand it. This helps explain why a good anchor works. It does not hold by weight alone, but by angle. A low, steady pull lets the flukes bite and stay buried. Too short a scope rips the anchor free. Once the road is set, 2 more controls calm the ship. A snubbing line can soften the jerks when a wave yanks the bow. And a second small anchor, if they carry one, might go astern to reduce swing. On a longship, the geometry is delicate. The hull is long and narrow, so yaw can build into a dangerous sweep. Lines fore and aft tame that motion, and keep the bow into breaking seas. Sometimes there is no good bottom to anchor on, or the shoreline offers better safety than open water. Then the crew considers a surf landing. Longships were built with that option in mind: shallow draft, strong keel, and a hull that can be beached and refloated. But the move is unforgiving. The timing must match the wave sets, and roles must be split with no overlap. The deck divides into 3 teams. The steering team aims for a gap and keeps the bow square to the foaming line. The oar team gives short, hard bursts to catch a lull, and then stop the ship from outrunning the water. The landing team gathers forward with poles and lines, ready to jump into knee-deep surf and control the bow. In practice, that jump is the most dangerous moment of the day. To avoid a broach, when the ship turns sideways and a wave rolls it, one trick is a stern line paid out as a brake. As the bow kisses sand, that line checks the hull from sliding. Then men on shore haul at the bow line to cant the hull above the next breaker. This is muscle and timing, not romance. A mistake here splits planks or breaks ankles. Communication tightens again. No one argues beach geometry in the foam. They use short words and do what they drilled. This helps explain why earlier routines around rations, rest, and gear placement matter now. When energy is spare, and every hand knows the motions, the ship spends less time exposed with its keel in the lift of the waves. Leadership in this pressure cycle follows a distinct curve. It begins collective and narrows. The steersman and 1 or 2 seasoned hands confer in seconds, reading sky, depth, and crew fatigue. That detail reveals the limit of Viking counsel at sea. Debate can shape preparation, but weather collapses the timeline. When the call comes, reef, heave to, anchor, or beach, the ship follows one voice. That one voice is not arbitrary. Authority grew from proven judgment with the steering oar, and an earned sense of what the hull could take. Sagas often give that person a name, but the principle is more general. On a working deck, power is the ability to choose where to spend risk. To back the sail now and lose miles, or to hold canvas 1 minute longer and pay for it in sweat at the oars. Under that stress, the culture that could be brutal ashore shows a different face. The same men who took pride in hard words in a saga scene also knew when to hold their tongues and bail. The grittier episode where a strong man refuses work and stings crewmates with insults survives because it was a lesson. At sea, status must bend to function. Survival rewarded disciplined restraint, There is a quieter echo, too. Medieval truce oaths promised peace, on ship or snowshoes, as if travel itself demanded another code. That phrasing makes sense on a longship. The vessel is a small state under threat, a rail-thin border between water and breath. Here, as on land, is not just. The sea forces its own agreements, enforced by wind and depth rather than law. As the squall passes, the systems unwind in reverse. The lookout's eyes widen again from deck edge to cloud line. The lead line slows to periodic checks. Bailers swap to rest. The halyard team stands by for a cautious hoist, not to full power, but to feel the air and test the cloth for strain. What mattered now was not getting back up to speed first, but getting up clean. If they anchored, the ritual of leaving is as careful as the setting. They wait for a synchronized lift of bow and slacken the rode, then heave, hand over hand. A fluke that dug in well needs persuasion. Mud and shell come up smelling of the bottom. That sample doubles as information. Sandbanks move. Mud flats hold. They log this in memory for the next return in weather. If they beached, resetting for sea becomes a shore drill. Oars become rollers. Men lever the hull off the sand at a high line of wash. Lines run to stakes or rocks for purchase. The mast, if struck, is raised in its fish and wedged with care, because a loose mast is a weapon in a seaway. This is where the longship's design shows its intelligence. Wow. It welcomes the land without being trapped by it. Across these minutes, the habit of cutting chatter to keywords lingers. It keeps the mind narrow enough to avoid the post-surge slump. In practice, the watch captain may lift his voice to reset the ordinary rules. Water, a mouthful of food, a rub of hands for warmth, then back to posts. The important point is that ordinary returns only because extraordinary discipline carried them through. There is a last seamanship problem in any squall's wake. The false, fair wind. Fresh air after rain can feel honest and steady, but the sea underneath still swings from the earlier blow. That mismatch can slap a ship that is too eager. Crews learn to raise cloth in steps, feel for the rhythm of the waves, then commit. The next step depended on reading not just air, but inertia. When they find their line again, the ship moves forward with that relief-tightened, quiet common after a scare. But the learning is not abstract. A new gouge in a thwart tells the story of a brace run too slow. A lash mark on a palm reminds a hand why reef knots matter. These small costs are the feedback loop that holds the larger system intact, and there is a strategic gain that never appears in verse. Every good switch under pressure preserves judgment for the next demand. When rowers are not burned out from dragging a full sail 5 minutes too long, they can still give a burst to dodge a floating log or edge clear of a shoal. When a lookout ate on time earlier, his voice holds steady through the 5th sounding call. That is the hidden arithmetic behind Viking reach. As evening resets, the sky opens a long, clean lane. The crew falls back into the night routine of the sharper edge. They know the drill will be asked for again, maybe before dawn. The questions shift forward. Are we still on course to make landfall by morning watch? And if not, where does this wind let us touch for water and rest without giving up our plan? That is where this pressure sequence points, toward the decision of where and how to end the day on terms chosen, not forced. A ridge of islands can be shelter or trap. An open coast can welcome a beaching or punish it with an unmarked bar. The systems we have watched, reefing in sequence, soundings on rhythm, anchoring with scope, and speech cut to signal, set the stage for that final choice. The sea does not remember the drill. The crew does. They carry the muscle and the measures forward, ready to spend them again if the night asks. Now comes landfall. It is where a longship shaped the shore it met, and where a day like this decided whether the meeting became trade or raid, or only a fire and sleep before more water. The weather has had its say. Now the coastline will answer. Evening brings the last big choice. With a squall behind them and cloth set short, they read the coast and decide, anchor off beach, or hold offshore until daylight. Each option solved a different problem. Anchoring off promised rest with a margin of safety. Beaching promised fire and hot food, but risk on a falling tide. Holding offshore postponed every comfort for the sake of clean information in the morning. The decision is framed by 3 clocks: light, tide, and fatigue. Light dictates how well they can see a channel or read the water's tone. Tide dictates whether a beach will cradle them or leave them stranded on ribs. Fatigue dictates how many errors are left in the crew. What mattered here was not bravery, but error budget. A tired hand misreading 10 fathoms as 8 could be the only mistake they could not afford. Saga writers noticed this tension. In one account, Thorstein's crew slid over a hidden rock because the tide was ebbing and the current fought them, so the ship had but little way. The fix was not heroism, but patience. They lowered sail, tried poles, found no bottom, and were obliged to wait for the incoming tide. That detail reveals a core habit. If the system could not move the ship safely, they let the tide move the system. Anchoring off, then, made sense when the bottom was known, or could be tested. A crewman cast the lead line, sometimes tallow on the base to sample sand or weed. This helped confirm that the anchor would bite and hold. They measured scope by feel and practice, not numbers on a clipboard. More line out in a gust, less if kelp threatened to foul. In practice, the quiet work after a storm was judgment exercised in small, reversible steps. Beaching was different. It was about compression. They looked for a lee cove with shelving sand and no breakers. A rising tide was insurance. They would aim to ground gently, then move fast. Oars out as rollers, hull lightened at once, and a kedge line laid to pull free at the next flood. The important point is not just technique, but sequencing. Every movement ashore simplified the next hour and cut the risk of being surprised by night or surf. Sometimes the answer was to stay offshore, heave to, and keep the ship in her own clear water. This helps explain why Bjarni Herjolfsson, when shown land that had an inhospitable look, chose to keep sailing rather than risk a poor landing. He even ordered a reef when the gale increased, putting survival over speed. From the outside, that can seem timid for Vikings. In practice, it was disciplined seamanship shaped by a long memory of coasts that punished haste. If they did make land on their terms, the routine ashore was plain and fast. A perimeter watch went up first, pairs set at angles that covered boat, beach approach, and the path inland. This watch was not only for enemies, it was to notice the tide line, drifting gear, or embers that could threaten a dry hull. That detail tells us something important. They treated safety as a circle, not a point. Next came heat. Fires ashore were timed and contained. Crews cooked when safe because longships were not hearth boats. Hot food, barley, salt meat, dried fish softened in a pot, restored bodies dulled by cold and rowing. They ate from the same ration rules that governed daytime, equal shares by bench, with adjustments for sick or injured. This worked because it took argument off the table. Fairness was procedure, not mood. Gear followed. Awnings were open to dry, cloaks were wrung, and any wet sail was unbent and aired if the breeze allowed. Salt stiffens fabric and rots seams. Drying was not comfort, it was longevity. Men checked rivets, lashings, and the thongs on their sea chests. Small mends at dusk were a form of banking. Every stitch now was an hour not lost tomorrow to a torn sheet or a sprung plank. The last administrative act was the night plan. Anchor watch rotated in short spells, chosen to balance the strongest rower's need for sleep with the need for alert eyes. Signals were agreed upon: 2 raps for wind shift, 3 for unknown craft, 1 long call for fire or dragging anchor. The important point is that sound replaced speech. In darkness, clarity depends on few simple sounds everyone already understands. Around these habits ran a harder frame of meaning. The ship was more than a tool. Sagas record kings burned on pyres set on their ships, the wind pushing flame and timber out to sea. Others describe fallen men laid in beached vessels, covered in earth and stones, mounds marked with standing stones. Even women, like the matriarch in later tales, were honored with ship-centered rites. This helps explain why a day aboard felt liturgical in its order. When a crew dried a sail with care, or shared food by bench, they were not playing sailor. They were tending an identity built from oak, iron, and memory. A ship could carry a family name, a leader's luck, and a crew's reputation. That pressure made systems conservative. You did not gamble a hull that might one day be your mound. What this day shows, end to end, is a blend often missed in the cliches. Yes, these people could be harsh, but the harshness sat inside a cultured organization. The rows, the watches, the men's, and the quiet votes all worked to keep risk inside human limits. That is why their reach stretched far. Distance was not conquered in a leap. It was converted by repetition. Row, sail, watch, mend, decide, then do it again tomorrow. A longship's real power was a practice day, repeated until shorelines became routes and routes became maps in the head. In other words, ordinary discipline made extraordinary voyages survivable. The carved prow mattered less than the hands behind it, moving in time to rules that held when the wind turned and the light went thin.